Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
Today I talked to a British musician. Our guest grew up admiring the music of the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix, went on to become interested in progressive rock and classical music. His early musical education took him to London Goldsmiths College and the Royal College of Music. Answering an advert in Melody Maker led him to form his first band and paved the way to a successful career in the 1980s with the band Wang Chung. The group had a huge following stateside, touring with bands such as the Romantics, Berlin and the Cars. Wang Chung's hits include Dance All Days, Everybody Have Fun Tonight, and Let's Go. The song Fire In the Twilight featured in the 1985 John Hughes film The Breakfast Club, and in the same year the band worked with filmmaker William Friedkin to compose the soundtrack for the film To Live and Die in L.A. Today I talked to musician Jack Hues about his love and desire to play music, the recording industry, fame, solo projects, and his well-known son. Thank you and welcome to Your Take. Lovely to see you. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks very much.
Good. I always like to start the interviews by going back to the very beginning and going back to your roots. I kind of wanted to start by asking you about your recollections of growing up in Gillingham in the late 1950s and the 1960s. Just wanted you to tell us a little bit about your parents, Rabina and Alan, your relationship with them, and the relationship with any siblings you may have had.
Yeah, I have one brother, my brother Mark, who's about 5-6 years younger than me, 5.5 years younger. So so Gillingham in the late 50s, 60s was quite a sort of grey place, as I recall it. So there's a sort of conglomeration of towns, Gillingham, Chatham, Rochester. And I suppose in those days they were centred on Chatham Dockyard, which was a big naval base. And there was also a big military barracks in Rochester and in Gillingham, I think. So there's a lot of sort of service people around, you know. So by the time I was in my teens and having sort of long hair and sort of I was a kind of proto Jimi Hendrix, really. I didn't really fit in visually and sometimes had to sort of run a bit smartish to get out of some of the shouting that was going on at me. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it was a strange place. I remember in 1989, I went to Berlin and just after the wall had come down. So East Berlin was still kind of as it was in the communist era, you know. And I know it's probably a little over the top to say it, but when I remember traveling into East Berlin and taking the sort of subway, well, it was like a tram actually, that took you out as far as you could possibly go. It's like sort of getting the train to Uxbridge or something in London, you know what I mean? And it trampled out through all the sort of suburbs of East Berlin and not exactly countryside, but went to this big park. And I remember sitting in a restaurant in this park and my wife and I were dressed, you know, very Western. And me was, you know, as 1989, I still thought I was a pop star and stuff. And nobody raised an eyelid, you know, even though we must have looked sort of extraordinary, nobody looked at us. And they just carried on doing what they're doing. And I got this overwhelming sense of like, this is like it was in Gillingham when I grew up, where very austere, really nothing much going on. Certainly people never looked at you or did anything unless they were going to kick your head in, that kind of thing. Yeah. And so it was a sort of pretty grim place growing up, as I think a lot of provincial towns were in England at that time.
And if we talk music, you're growing up in an interesting time because we've seen the kind of 1950s rock and roll revolution, and now we see the British invasion in the 1960s.
Yeah.
You could name countless bands. We could be here forever with the Beatles and the Stones and the Hollies and all these great groups.
Yeah.
But what were the kind of bands when you were growing up that really kind of turned you on? And were there any that you kind of sat and listened to and thought, you know, I need to be doing that. I need to be picking up an instrument. I want to do what these guys or women are doing. Was there any band that kind of did it for you?
Yeah, the Beatles were that, you know, and it's a cliche to say it, but yeah, things suddenly went into Technicolor when I heard the Beatles track in this otherwise grey sort of vista. And, you know, I'm not saying like I had an unhappy childhood. It was okay, you know, but just trying to capture that sense of the provincial town. But yeah, music, pop music, the emerging pop music as it was for me then. And we're talking sort of 1963, I suppose, when I sort of heard the Beatles for the first time. Yeah, it was in that the world went into colour, and then pretty much immediately I wanted to play guitar, and I think certainly as soon as I saw them on television, you know. So my dad was a musician, like a part-time musician, in the sense that he had a day job working for the local council as a sort of draftsman. But in the evenings, he would play in various bands. In the early 60s, it was in other bands. But from about probably 1966, 67 onwards, he had his own kind of dance band. And so anyway, he was a musician, and so when I saw the Beatles and said I want to get a guitar, he was encouraging, you know, and didn't say, well, I'll learn piano, a sensible instrument, you know. He said, he got me the guitar, but the condition was that I had to have lessons. So I went to this, what I consider to be an old lady. She probably was sort of 50 or something. And,
sure.
And she gave me lessons, but it was cool. She taught me to read music, and she taught me to play guitar, but not in a kind of, it wasn't like you have to hold it this way and sit this way and it's all classical stuff. She encouraged, I used to take along Beatles sheet music to the lessons, and she would encourage me to figure out the chords and seemed quite into it herself, really, in a slightly old-fashioned kind of way. So yeah, but the Beatles were there, and then I did love the Kinks. I remember You Really Got Me, and the Stones, Satisfaction. You know, all the very mainstream stuff. But I guess access in Gillingham was limited to what was on the radio, and I think they started selling records in Boots and the sort of some of the bigger, and Smiths, which was like a sort of newsagent's place, you know. But there wasn't, without going to London, there was really no access to buying music and stuff.
We've established a musical influence from your father, who was a musician and played. Obviously, Beatlemania and the British invasion as well was huge. And you say what an influence the Fab Four were. You've also got an interest in classical music, and I kind of wanted to ask you how that came about.
Well, that came later, really, because I was into the Beatles, and then it was, you know, so I was sort of 12 when Sgt. Pepper came out, which was sort of young, really, to appreciate the drug references and stuff. I didn't really understand all that. But what I got was the complexity of the music, the musical structures, you know, a song like A Day in the Life, that kind of very dissonant section of A Day in the Life was really like nothing I'd ever heard, you know, in a way that's hard to appreciate these days. I think, you know, access to music is so straightforward now, you know. Yeah, and then I was listening to prog bands like Genesis and Yes. So it wasn't until I was doing sort of A-level music, you know, so when I was 16 plus, that I started to kind of get more interested in classical music. It definitely had a sort of allure for me, but I really didn't love it, you know. But I do remember a class where I was asked to, the teacher was away, I think he was sick or on holiday or something, and the class work was to listen to a piece by Schubert called his Unfinished Symphony, and then I had to answer questions on it. And I remember playing that piece and being completely blown away by it. And I still think that that's an incredible entry point into classical music, actually, because it's really unlike anything that came before it or after it, you know. So there was these sort of little glimmers of things that I really wanted to get to know more. But it wasn't until I got to university, really, that I started listening to classical music almost exclusively. And then I suppose the things that I really got into were the more modern things. So the music of Alban Berg was very important to me. He wrote an opera called Wozzeck, which is a lot of people these days still think of as modernist and difficult and so on. But it's really not. It's really incredible, dramatic music. And I was into Stravinsky and the more kind of avant-garde end of classical music, I suppose, and with modernists, not so much into Shostakovich and the sort of symphonic composers, but more into this kind of more sort of colourful stuff, you know. And that's an interest that sustains to this day, really.
I wanted to move on and talk about a key point in your life, your musical education. You went to Goldsmiths College and the Royal College of Music. I just wanted you to kind of sum up your time studying at these institutions. And was it a good educational tool, for going on and actually, you know, earning from the music business, which you've done ever since after your musical education. So just wanted to find out a bit about your time there and the experience gained, the people you met and so on.
Yeah, I guess it was because it was classical music, you know, in those days you couldn't study rock and jazz and stuff like you can now, you know. So it was a kind of, and it was taught in a very old fashioned way, you know, at Goldsmiths as well, you know. I think what it did was just broaden my musical horizons and toughened up my listening. You know, you had to do tests, you know, ear tests, and you had to write counterpoint, and you had to do all the sort of old-fashioned stuff that you had to do in the 19th century, really. You know, and the course was like a course from the 1920s or 30s, really. You know, the Royal College. You know, I went there to study composition and electronic music. That was. I wasn't doing a degree as such or any kind of qualification. I'd won this competition that was set up by the BBC. It was like a sort of young composers competition. And 3 people, the prize was that you got your work performed on Radio 3 as it is now, you know. So I won that competition, and that in a sense propelled me to sort of want to look into that more. And that's how I got the place at the Royal College. But again, the Royal College, you know, it was another world, really. It was the first time I'd really met middle-class people, I think. And I mean proper middle-class people, not people who like olives, as a politician once said.
Would you say, was that a bit of a culture shock to you at the time?
At the time, it didn't really bother me because I was fairly confident in my identity. I mean, one never thought about it in those terms. You know, I was just who I was. You know, I sort of used to wear these kind of, I remember I used to wear my dad's D-mob suit quite a lot, do you mean, in a white shirt. And I had a strong sense of my identity, like I say. So I look around at these people, you know, the girls all dressed in sort of like floral dresses and stuff, and they all were into strawberries and Wimbledon and, you know, boating on the, you know, they've all been to Oxford and places like that.
Okay.
So it was, you know, and I didn't really get that there were these massive social divisions. You didn't notice it so much somehow in the 60s, especially if you were into music, because everything seemed very equalized somehow, you know. It was, but I got to the Royal College that I just didn't fit in anywhere. I didn't make any friends there, really, you know. I had a couple of girlfriends, but nothing very serious, you know. And I was living at the time with a friend of mine, Ron Chadwick, who's an artist. And we were living in what was almost a squat, really, in South London. And my life with him was probably more adventurous and interesting. You know, we go to parties and all the time, and you know, various people would come around, and I did a few gigs with. There was a sort of jazz band that played in Greenwich, which was close to where we were living, and I did a couple of gigs with them, and you know, so I was sort of experimenting with a lot of different things, and that was probably more how my life progressed at that time, rather than, you know, the Royal College was a sort of curiosity. It was nice to go into London and walk through Hyde Park to get there and stuff, you know. But I'm not sure that I really learned anything there, apart from there was this whole other way of looking at the world that had never occurred to me before.
It kind of leads me to my next question. You mentioned that you didn't really feel that you fitted in. You spent a year there, and then you decided to move on and pursue a career in music. What kind of made you make that decision? Were you supported by your family at the time? And did you have any fears or reservations, or?
No, there was only ever plan A, which wasn't really even a plan. It was just like I was playing, you know, I guess when I was at the college, I was writing, what should we say? I remember writing a string quartet, but using a very strange notation system that I sort of invented myself, so nobody could play it. I wrote an orchestral piece as well, so I was doing that stuff. But once I left, I started writing songs again, really. And I moved back home initially because I had no money, and, you know, so I lived with my parents for a couple of months. And that's really when I did a bit of work with a band in the Medway Towns in Gillingham, you know. But I started writing songs again, and that was just my natural vocabulary, if you know what I mean. It's like I could kind of, you know, turn my attention to, say, like writing a string quartet. I understood technically what was required, but I didn't know any string quartet players. Do you know what I mean? So there was no practical way of getting it out there. And of course, in those days, you were taught music literally in a sort of ivory tower, really. There was no sort of like, well, you need to befriend. If you're going to be a composer, you need to know some conductors, you need to know some orchestral musicians. You need to know people who are going to play your work, you know. That was never mentioned, you know. So when I came out, there was this sort of deafening silence, really. But the people that I did know were people in bands, you know. And so I did a bit of local work, and then I thought, I really need to be doing this in London, you know. So I moved to London. And that's when I met Nick, essentially, through an ad in the Melody Maker.
I wanted to move on to that, the formation of your first band, originally from answering an ad in Melody Maker.
Yeah.
But I wanted to kind of ask you what the music scene was like in the UK at the time. We're talking about the late 1970s. And I just wanted to ask you about Nick Feldman, who would later become Wang Chung bassist.
Yeah.
Just how you met, and a little bit about the scene around the late 1970s.
Well, the scene was punk, basically, you know, and when I left the Royal College, so that would have been 1977, I was really into the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks album. And I was into that emerging scene. I got it, you know. I was into Talking Heads. I guess the American bands always sort of appealed to me a little more, because they weren't really punk bands. They were sort of art rock bands. So Talking Heads and Blondie. There's a band called Television that I loved, and I remember going to see Television at Hammersmith Odeon, where they were supported by Blondie. And Blondie are amazing. You know, they were like such a sort of high energy band, you know. Television, by comparison, were a bit more laid back, still great as well, you know. So I was really into that. And when I met Nick, he too was very inspired by that scene, but was trying to do something slightly more. I always sort of say he had written these songs that had jazz chords in them, you know, rather than just straight blues chords, you know. And I found that really appealing, and also found it very easy to work within that sort of extended idiom, if you like. Whereas I think the other guitarists he auditioned didn't really get that, you know. So we when we met, you know, I mean, Nick's a lovely guy, but so we got on straight away as people. But our musical tastes did sort of coincide in quite an unusual way, and that we weren't just into punk and into this kind of quite gritty 3-chord sort of thing, you know. We were more into, well, not more into, but as well as that, we were into Todd Rundgren and Chic and Sly and the Family Stone and Marvin Gaye. You know, it was a much more mixed bag. And of course, David Bowie, we were both heavily into. And I guess Bowie, when I was studying classical music, Bowie was the one artist that I still bought his albums and sort of kept track of what he was doing, because he was always involved in a quite sophisticated sense of what music was and what it was communicating. You know.
You were in a number of bands in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Bands included the Intellectuals and 57 Men.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, how did Wang Chung come about? And a little bit about the origins of the name. Can you tell us where the name came from?
Yeah, well, all of those bands were me and Nick, you know, with various lineups around us. You know, so to begin with, Nick was fronting it in the Intellectuals, and then 57 Men. We decided to get a singer in because neither of us felt we were really delivering on that front. So Glenn Gregory was the singer who went on to form Heaven 17. Lee Gorman was on bass, who went on to be in Bow Wow Wow, you know. And Darren was on drums, you know. And then we sort of, you know, there was a sort of cycle really of you write some songs, rehearse them up, go and do some gigs, do some demos. The demos would attract record company people to come and see you play live. They see you play live and think, nah, you know, okay, so, you know. And so that was the end of that really. You know, you certainly had to sort of rethink it, you know. So Wang Chung was the sort of final rethink, which was essentially me, Nick and Darren, a sort of power trio. You know, the Police were very big at that time, and that was a kind of a good model. And also Nick and I were really into the Cream, you know, so power trios were, I could see how all that worked. Yeah, so with Wang Chung, we decided that we do the demos, but we wouldn't play live, so that it became just a bit more mysterious. And choosing the name Wang Chung was, in a sense, just a slightly ridiculous thing to do. I mean, I don't know if you've been in bands, but there comes a point where you've got to choose a name and you spend days, weeks, months, maybe sort of casting around for something. And I came across this name, Wang Chung. In those days, it was spelled Huang. And it was in a book that I was reading about Stockhausen, who was an avant-garde German composer, very prolific in the 60s, well, 50s, 60s, 70s, you know. And he was talking about Wang Chung, this Chinese term for a sort of, well, it's been explained so many times in interviews, but, you know, essentially Wang Chung is this pitch that emanates from a yellow bell. So Wang Chung means sort of the yellow bell. The yellow bell rings a billion different frequencies. One of those frequencies is our vibration, our human reality. You know? Right, and music is supposed to chime in with that, you know. But when I saw it, I thought it just sounded like a Wang Chung, sort of sounded like a guitar thing. And I don't know, I just had this sort of quirky sense of it. And I mentioned it to Nick and he goes, oh, let's go with that, you know. So we had this Chinese name, but I guess there were bands like Japan, Susie and the Banshees were doing, you know, Hong Kong Garden, that had this sort of Oriental thing going on. There was China Crisis as well. So there were a whole bunch of these sort of post-punk, post-new romantic, slightly orientalized bands, you know. And it was a sort of fun thing, although I was really, one of the things I did enjoy at Goldsmiths was learning about music from other cultures, you know, so I was into Javanese gamelan music and that in particular, and how that related to Debussy and Steve Reich and composers like that. So it wasn't like I just plucked it out of thin air, you know. I was sort of interested in Orientalism in Western music, but and in the music itself, you know. But yeah, it was a sort of it was like an eccentric choice, that's for sure. But it sort of worked out well in the end.
When you initially formed the band, did you have a particular vision of what kind of music you wanted to perform? Did you want to kind of go for the kind of the pop thing, or what was kind of your vision to start with? I also wanted to talk about being signed, your first contract with Rewind Records. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess as an artist, you don't really consciously think about what you're shooting for, but you are, of course, being influenced by all the stuff you're hearing. You're seeing what's successful, you're seeing, you know, what you like, and obviously there's always this line that you've got to stride, as it were, between art and commerce, you know. And so you can't just simply do what you want, even though I advocate that to my students, you know, like being yourself is the most important thing as an artist, I think. But you do have to keep an eye on the commercial viability of what you're doing if you want to make a living at it, you know. So I guess my sense of Wang Chung at that point was to be doing, there was a band called the Comsat Angels that were around at the time that I really loved. I mean, they were more disciplined than us in that they sort of kept the songs shorter. But I suppose from my sort of prog fascinations, you know, with Zeppelin and Yes and King Crimson, you know, the sense of a track lasting 10, 15 minutes to me was pretty cool, you know. And also listening to a lot of classical music, you know, the longer form structures appeal to me. So I wanted to have a bit of that in Wang Chung. But I respected the pop song, you know, the sense of conveying your ideas in a sort of 3.5 minute format as well, which is very difficult to do. I think anybody who achieves that successfully is worthy of respect, I think, you know. So Wang Chung was a sort of hybrid, but I saw it as a sort of art rock kind of band, really, you know, and that's certainly how I wanted it to be seen.
I'm interested to hear your take on this, but it seems that one of the major breakthroughs in your career was your manager, David Massey.
Yes.
Ending your contract with Arista and signing with Geffen Records.
Yeah.
How did you kind of feel about that business decision at the time? And when you look back 30, 40 years with hindsight, how do you see it now? Do you think that was an instrumental business decision?
It was a good decision, but one, of course, has no idea whether it's good or bad at the time. I know David was very, you know, I mean, he's gone on to be a very successful A&R guy and signed all sorts of amazing people. You know? But at the time, he was very new to the music business. And so, yeah, I remember a couple of meetings where he sort of said things that were incredibly naive. Even I could tell that, you know, and could see the record company guys slightly flinch, you know. But the fact was, he was a really good businessman, and he believed passionately in Wang Chung as a sort of world-class act, you know. So, and I think that was the key thing, really, you know, because there's no book about, well, there are books about how to manage a band now, but I wouldn't bother with them particularly. You know? So there's no rule book, you know, it's very instinctive. But the most important thing is that you think your band is amazing, you know, and David did. And he was very bright. And I think business people, you know, in America, the music business, especially in those days, was a proper business, you know, unlike the UK, where it was more, I don't know, I won't say amateur because that's insulting, but, you know, there wasn't the same kind of gritty determination and sort of logic that was applied in the States. You know, when a record company signed you, they signed you because they thought you would sell a lot of records, and they invested money to achieve that goal. You know, it wasn't such a sort of whimsical thing as it was in the UK. You know? So yeah, David Massey was very important in the success of Wang Chung.
Moving on from your manager and that key sort of business decision, how do you look back at the early success of Wang Chung, and particularly highlights from the years 1983 up to 85? And I specifically wanted to ask you about life touring on the road with bands like the Romantics. You toured with Berlin and the Cars. What were those experiences like at that sort of period? Yeah,
I mean, complex, you know, it's a complex set of experiences and emotions. You know, I mean, I think that the thing that enabled the shift to the States was Dancehall Days, really, which was a sort of had a feel that seemed to, I guess it had us. I always think that it was influenced by the band Little Feat. I know it's a sort of slightly obscure thing, and there are obviously a lot of other influences as well.
Tremendous band as well, tremendous musicians.
Yeah. But you know, I sort of wanted that shuffle to kind of sound like the way, you know, Richie Hayward and Sam Clayton would play it, you know. But obviously we ended up with more Adam and the Ants, and that was also part of what we wanted. We were working with Chris Hues in the studio, who was part of Adam and the Ants at one stage, because he knew how to get that sort of Burundi feel in the drums, and which was part of what we were doing, you know. But yeah, with the touring, it was stressful, I think, is how I found it, you know. If not, but amazing as well, you know, playing the really big gigs with the Cars and later on with Tina Turner were amazing experiences, you know. Playing the theatres, we did some of our own shows in theatres with the Romantics and various other bands. That was great too. I think I think I have this tendency to sort of just like go, you know, shut down to everything that's going on around me and just plough my own little furrow, you know, and sometimes that's useful and sometimes not. But I think it was probably fairly useful for me, as I suppose a sensitive person, in that sort of situation. You know, I kind of got myself through it, you know. So, but you know, I'm sounding like it was, well, I remember having a conversation with Nick and saying, you know, being on in a band and being on tour is a bit like being in the army and being in a war, you know, because you can't really explain what it's like to people who haven't actually done it, you know. And it is this sort of, I think that's why bands draw very close, you know, when they're in that situation. And certainly Nick and I, you know, are very close as people. And yeah, it's an extraordinary experience.
I'd imagine it's very hard. You're away from family, if you have family at the time. You're living out of a suitcase, and also you're kind of bombarded by media that want a piece of you every kind of minute. And you're obliged to do that because you're promoting a record, a concert.
Yeah.
And then you've got the fans as well. And you know, the fans make you. Yeah. But also at the same time, not being rude, I'd imagine you meet some quite odd, but yeah, interesting people at the same time who just want a piece of you. And I kind of guess you forget your own identity in a way because you become a piece of something else in the jigsaw puzzle, I guess.
I think I managed to sort of, I don't know, I sort of say I managed to retain my sense of myself, but I think you do lose it actually. You do become swept up in the craziness of it all, you know. And yeah. It's when I talk to people now, I remember having a conversation with a person in a coffee shop here in Canterbury a couple of years ago, and they sort of said, you know, so what do you do? And I said, I'm a musician. And then I talked a little about what I'd done, and they were sort of really like open-mouthed at like, you know, like what a life you've had, you know. And I think, yeah, especially now when people are trying to, you know, young guys, girls, you know, forming bands, trying to have that sort of experience, it's much more, or it's much less clear how you achieve that, you know, apart from an extremely sort of whimsical sense of, well, maybe you'll have a big song on YouTube or Spotify or something, you know. But, you know, there was a sort of path back in the 80s that you could take. So there was a sort of sense of structure to it. And the things that happened were, you know, explainable kind of thing, you know. But it was an extraordinary number of years. That sort of, as you say, 83 through to when Nick and I stopped working together, which was sort of 89, I guess. You know, it was an extraordinary time.
I'm going to look at 1985 because after your second album called Points on the Curve, you worked with one of my all-time favorite directors, an incredible filmmaker, William Friedkin.
Yeah.
For, in my view, probably his last great film, To Live and Die in L.A.
Okay.
How did that come about? And what was it like working with somebody like Friedkin, who was a very prolific Hollywood filmmaker coming off the back of, you know, Academy Award success with The French Connection and obviously the Exorcist as well. Yeah, yeah.
Well, it came literally out of the blue. I sort of talked about it more in other interviews. I think, you know, how we were sort of, we'd had the hit records with Dance All Days and Don't Let Go off of the Points on the Curve album, you know, and the record company wanted us to make obviously a follow-up album with another Dance All Days on it. And we were struggling with that, frankly. You know? And this phone call from Friedkin came in the middle of a sort of situation where we were taking time out to write, you know. So it came at a perfect time. And I literally had the conversation with Billy, as I now know him, and we talked a lot about music and movies and what he was working on. He was very clear about what he wanted, in that he liked the track Wait from Points on the Curve, and he wanted more music like that. So but more than that, you know, Friedkin's an extraordinary guy, sort of a real artist, really very creative guy. So the conversation, I think, worked at a lot of different levels. And I think I said in the past, it was a bit like downloading what I needed to do from him. It's not in what he said. It was some other level of like getting a very clear sense of what was required. Also, Friedkin's very good at choosing the right person. You know, it's like, I sometimes think with bands, you know, bands struggle sometimes because the ingredients in the bands aren't right, you know, and from that it's very difficult to get anything to work, you know. And I think about an artist like Miles Davis, for example, you know, who chose great musicians to be in his band and then just said, be great, get on with it, and didn't try and direct them and get in the way, you know. And Friedkin was similar, you know, he liked Wait. he liked me, I think, after the conversation that we had, you know, and he was just kind of like, just go and do it. He didn't say, I'm going to come over and supervise. He didn't say, come to Los Angeles and do it there, you know. He just let us get on with it. And I think when you do that with creative artists, then you get the best with them. But you do have to make the right decision about who you're working with in the first place, you know. So working with Friedkin was, yeah, an extraordinary experience. Getting to know him as a person as being extraordinary. You know, he's a serious man, sort of intellectual, interested in all sorts of stuff. He knows a lot of different things. And also he came from old Hollywood as well. So rather like Spielberg and Coppola and Scorsese, those sort of guys, they began working in a sort of studio system in Hollywood. And then they kind of created that new Hollywood, that their movies sort of created it, you know. And Friedkin was a part of that. So his stories about working in old Hollywood and working with Hitchcock, you know, working with Harold Pinter, who he came over and sort of stayed with, and he made a movie of one of Pinter's plays, The Birthday Party, I think. And, you know, things like that. He's a serious guy. He was also, I remember him talking about Fritz Lang as well. And he did an amazing interview with Fritz Lang when Fritz Lang was quite an old man.
Oh, wow.
And so he, you know, he's a heavyweight, Billy. You know, he's and being around him, sort of staying at his house sometimes, you know, going to the LA Philharmonic with him. Those are things that I really treasured, you know, in my sort of, well, it's professional life. In a way, there's no division at a point. I think, you know, you just are doing all that stuff. And that's another thing I think I learned from Friedkin, that it's like you're not one person at your work and another person away from it. You're just that person, and you just, everything is grist to the mill in a sense.
There seems to be a big fondness today for 1980s cinema, particularly people of my sort of age in their sort of 40s onwards. But cinema plays a key part in the band's career because your music's featured in some really big films culturally at the time, like the Breakfast Club, Inner Space, which was another big film in the sort of late 1980s. Are you a film fanatic? And I know in these cases, the films, the actual tracks were used for the film. But how does film composition differ from, say, just making an album, for example? Is there kind of a different process for you? How does it kind of work?
Well, I think with To Live and Die in L.A., because I didn't see the film before I wrote the music, and you know, I wasn't working to the movie itself, as it were. It was a very spontaneous process that was like making an album, really, you know, but more extreme in a sense, in that I did it in a week, you know, rather than 6 months, which was, I'd taken the previous two albums I'd done were much more long form. But yeah, am I a film fanatic? I guess no is the answer. I sort of, I don't enjoy sort of modern movies particularly, you know, and haven't done since the 80s in a way. I mean, there are some great movies. I think my favorite more recent movie is a movie called The Great Beauty, which is an Italian movie. So that's a movie that some friends of mine would look at and say, well, what's it about? What's the story? And it's like, well, there is no story. And I guess I have a problem with narrative. And I suppose it's movies with a strong story narrative where you've got to figure out what's going on all the time. They bore me to death, really, because I can't really understand what's going on. And I'm not terribly interested most of the time. But movies that are more impressionistic in the way they work, I enjoy more. And then the soundtrack is also incredibly important to me. And I feel that the modern obsession with soundtracks that basically never stop, you know, that begin at the beginning and there's sort of music playing all the time, they just drive me crazy. I feel like Lord of the Rings to me is wrecked by, I think, a not good soundtrack. And the fact that it's playing all the time, sort of vaguely suggesting an emotion that you can see perfectly well on the screen. You know? And so movies sort of drive me nuts a bit, really. I feel very critical of them a lot of the time, you know. But when they're great, they're great. And I think the other thing about movies is that they affect me a lot. You know, the movies are very visceral. And they get right into your head and your body. And I think I find that sometimes a bit overwhelming with movies too, you know. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with movies. Yeah.
I'm interested to find your take on the finished film of To Live and Die in L.A. What were your opinions when you first saw it? And what were your opinions on the finished composed soundtrack that you did for the film?
Well, the first time I saw it was, Friedkin got in touch after we sent all this music to him, and he sort of cut the music into the film. I mean, these days he very generously says that he cut the movie to the music, which I don't think is strictly true. But there are instances, I think, where he constructed scenes around the music and let the music flow, sort of dominate the pace of the film. And I think that makes for a really interesting movie. And the first time I saw it was in a preview cinema with him, before I'd written the song To Live and Die in L.A. Because one of his instructions in that first hour-long conversation was, what I don't want is a song called To Live and Die in L.A. I want, soundtrack and stuff, So initially I didn't write the song, but when I saw the film for the first time, I was blown away by it. And I think I've said many times, sitting next to Billy, watching that opening scene especially, which is the sort of like the gunshot and then the sort of sunrise or sunset, I'm never quite sure, over LA, and the storm and the music. It was just amazing experience. I still feel the emotion of that as I talk about it every time. But when I got back to the UK, I just couldn't help but write a song called To Live and Die in LA. It just sort of came out. And I played it to Nick, and he was like, this is good. And so we did a demo of it and sent it to Bill. And again, great, generous, creative artist that he is, he didn't say, oh, it's okay. But he said, okay, I'll reshoot at the beginning of the movie and, we'll use it, So, so that was amazing. So the finished thing, I love. I think it's an amazing movie. I love the first 20 minutes of To Live and Die in L.A., especially the prologue thing, and then the way he sets up. He does it in the French Connection as well. He takes quite a long time to set up the atmosphere, and it's quite fragmented. It's not all linear. Here's the story. Here are the characters, and all this. It's and it took me quite a long time. I mean, I'm hopeless with narrative anyway, but it took me quite a long time to really work out what was going on at any given time. But I think with Billy, the way he made the film was, it's not terribly important that you really understand what's going on, other than that you see the gradual decline of these cops to the dark side, as it were, in order to be able to survive in the world that they were in. And that, of course, is always a theme in his films, the light and the dark, and where you are at any given moment on that sort of spectrum of possibilities.
Sure, I love Willem Dafoe as
he's a great
the villain. Yeah, and he's a very interesting actor as well.
Brilliant.
I've got one final question about Wang Chung, and we'll move on to your solo projects in recent years and your current tour as well. Wang Chung were very successful in the US. Why don't you think the band were kind of a major hit here in the UK? What's your take on that?
Combination of things, I think. I think when you're signed to an American label, their perspective on the world is primarily US based, and they'll push you in Australia, Japan, Germany, sort of what they consider to be big markets. But the UK is not a big market from an American perspective. And I remember having a conversation with one of the guys at Geffen, and sort of they were saying, essentially Britain's great for innovation and for up and coming bands. So if you sign a band who has an English record deal and you do the deal for them in America, so they've broken the UK, they're big in the UK, and then you try and break them around the world, and that's viable, But to have a band that's big in America and try and break them in the UK, which is what they would have effectively had to have done with us, because our Arista album was not a huge record at all. Would be, from an American perspective, again, just very difficult, because, they've got to prevail on the BBC, to sort of be into it. And the BBC wouldn't promote an American record, really. They promote English stuff, So we were in this sort of slightly difficult situation. And plus, I think the press here saw us as an American band and didn't particularly like what we stood for, which is this very sort of commercial Americanized, shiny thing, and that we were sort of good musicians as well. I think the Impress are all, well, not so much these days, but back then, the punk ethic of 3 chords and a leather jacket, and ideally a heroin addiction, is de rigueur, you know. And if you're not that, then it's kind of like, well, you're fake. You're just like, you know. So, and I get that, you know, that's okay, you know. So, yeah, I get why we were not sort of encouraged in the UK, but I think these days with everything sort of falls into the realm of entertainment, and entertainment is a global industry. There's a whole different sense of Wang Chung these days, and I think if you're into American movies and you come to Wang Chung through that direction, then yeah, you get the band much better.
Outside of Wang Chung, what other musical projects are you most proud of? And you've obviously, over the many years, worked with so many different musicians. Which ones have you enjoyed collaborating with the most?
Well, I guess the big collaborations, the one I did with Tony Banks, needless to say, the keyboard player in Genesis, that little band Genesis. That was a great collaborative project for me because I was a huge Genesis fan, the Peter Gabriel years in particular. You know, when I was a kid, I was listening to those albums before I went to school, and you know, they sort of in my grey life. Well, my life wasn't particularly grey, but the town I was in was. Yeah, they were, you know, Watch of the Skies. I can remember playing it every morning before I got on the bus to school, and it sort of got me through the day. Really, you know, it felt, you know. So the opportunity to work with Tony and get to know him. And I met the other, you know, Phil and Mike as well. You know, I don't know them anything like as well, but Tony became a friend, and that's a really important friendship to me. But I enjoyed working on that album. You know, Tony's very clear about what he wants, how he wants things done. He gave me a lot of license, you know, into sort of write some lyrics for him and stuff. So he got me involved in the project in a great way. And yeah, I think it's a good album. I think if you are into the earlier Genesis records, then his Strictly Inc. is the album I did with him. It is worth investigating. And then I did some production work with Chris Hues, and I worked on a band called The Definition of Sound. And they did an album that was really cool, I think. I did some string arrangements on that, and that was great. And I worked with a band called Arcana as well. That was working with Nick, really, who was the A&R guy. And they did an album which is on Spotify, actually. It's called The Family Album. And I was listening to it not so long ago. It's a really great record, I think. And again, that record came out when the record business was sort of disintegrating, really, you know, and it was really sort of bottom line accountancy that was running the business. And, you know, they just didn't cut it in some way. I know they were marketed heavily in the Philippines for some reason and had a hit over there. But yeah, so a lot of things were good, you know. And then I think in the noughties, I got much more interested in jazz, really. And I was fortunate to meet Sam Bailey, who's a jazz musician who lives here in Canterbury. And I think jazz musician, he's really into sort of improvised music, some of which is jazz, some of which is much more avant-garde. But we started sort of rehearsing together or just playing together, you know. And I got particularly into the music of Thelonious Monk. And Sam and I would play through Monk tunes and, you know, a few glasses of wine and stuff. And out of that came this band called The Quartet eventually. And that really came out of sort of jamming at my house here, doing some gigs in Canterbury. There was a little club here called the Orange Street Music Club, and we played there. We were dreadful, really, you know, but you could be there. People just were much more open about it, you know. And the quartet sort of went through various changes and stuff. Chris Hughes got really interested in what I was doing and invited me down to Bath, invited the band to Bath to make an album, which he put out on his label Helium. And there's an album called Illuminated and an album called Shattering. And those two albums I'm very proud of as very undiluted sort of examples of what I was trying to do at that time. And then I went on to work with a couple of poets, Simon Smith and David Hurd. They run the creative writing course at Kent University. And that was a fascinating project. And then through them, I met a guy called Kelvin Corcoran, who's a brilliant writer, I think. And I wrote some songs with him. So I had this whole sort of long journey in a sense from about 2000 through to about 2012, you know, writing this, I suppose in a sense reconnecting with some of my sort of composition classes that I took when I was at university, but trying to sort of extend the whole notion of rock music and especially taking on board the sort of jazz concepts of a much more sort of open approach to how you're working with musicians. And I try and bring that to my latest solo albums, which ostensibly are much more like sort of prog rock albums in a sense. But the way I structure the songs means that when we're playing them live, there's scope for improvisation. And I think on the most recent album, which is going to be released on September the 3rd, that really comes to the fore. The songs are part Bitches Brew, the Miles Davis album, In a Silent Way, and part, I don't know, Pink Floyd's Medal, somewhere down the middle.
You obviously have so much experience in music,
yeah,
with your career, your experience in education and so on. But with the music industry, they're very keen on categorizing things, you know, to obviously sell to an audience.
Yeah.
Do you find that particularly frustrating, particularly where you've played all sorts of music from pop to jazz to blues? And do you think there is a lot of musical snobbery coming from the background that you came from with classical music and jazz and so on?
It's not so much snobbery as ignorance, I think. You know, I think people who are, you know, in the classical world, you know, they don't investigate rock music. I mean, it's a lot less ghettoized than it used to be, you know. And I think although I have big problems with streaming and the way it's financed, especially, do you know what I mean? And I think that really does have to change, because it just doesn't encourage musicians. You know, they're really relegated to a very low status and they can't earn a living out of it, you know. I'm not saying it needs to go back to the ridiculous overpaid days of, you know, artists who were very successful in the 70s and 80s, but there needs to be some sort of balance, you know. But yeah, I think, you know, as an artist, you see it from a different perspective. You've got all these influences swirling around. You take a bit of this, you take a bit of that, mix it all up and create the next thing you're creating. And the whole sense of like, well, is it blues or is it rock or is it jazz? Or to me are sort of really meaningless questions. But I do get as well that I'm in a commercial business. I'm not, you know, getting Arts Council grants to kind of, you know, explore my artistic identity. You know, I've got to make a living out of it as well. I'm very fortunate to still have income from the Wang Chung stuff, you know, but I get that, you know, you've got to sort of align yourself in some ways. And the way that I've been sort of embraced, as it were, by the prog fraternity in this country, especially more recently, I'm very grateful for, and I like being part of that. I like being part of a bunch of guys who are doing similar things, you know. And I think, interestingly, there are some 80s artists, you know. Gary Kemp has released an album recently, you know, where he's unashamedly pursuing a prog thing. He's done a bit of work with King Crimson as well, I think. I may be getting mixed up here, but and I think Midge Ure has done a sort of prog-oriented thing, you know, where they actually use the word in what they're doing, because prog, like jazz, is a four-letter word that for some people is not acceptable, you know. But it's an interesting realm, I think, you know. And yeah, I guess I just feel very fortunate to still have the energy in myself, if you like, to want to write the songs, the space and the freedom at my house to record these albums, and the enthusiasm of some friends and local musicians who want to support me and play in the band and are willing to rehearse, and, you know, for very little money, and but who are happy to get on board and support it all. And hopefully these gigs in September will be really fun for us, and even more importantly for the audience.
You mentioned the whole digital thing, and people now having to get their music out on the various platforms that obviously don't pay them the money that the royalties like it did 30 to 40 years ago. What's your kind of advice to young artists today who want to make a living from music? I'd imagine it's more harder than ever, even though there's more opportunity and it's easier to record. There seems to be so many restrictions and hurdles in place to actually earn a salary or
Yeah.
generate your income solely from music?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think, you know, in all of the conversation that we've just had, you know, especially when we're talking about David Massey and the music business and being signed to American labels and stuff like that, all of it is really predicated on great songs. And I don't say that in an arrogant kind of way, you know, but I think I would say to a young artist, write and listen. You know, write in a slightly obsessive way. And if you come up with a great idea, that is going to get some sort of traction. You know, people are going to get into it, even if it's just your sort of local area, but that can expand. And if you keep going as well, you know, I always think it's not that hard to have a hit song, you know, but what's difficult is sustaining it, you know, and I have a great admiration for, you know, the great artists, you know, the Madonnas and the U2s and the, you know, who sort of have gone through phases and worked with different producers and different styles and things and adapted themselves to prevailing trends and so on, so that they can keep going. But the thing that keeps them going is always a great song, you know. So I still believe that, you know. So, you know, if you're a writer, feel encouraged, you know, that a great song will cut through, and a great song can get into a movie soundtrack or be part of something else, something bigger that sort of, you know, starts to get into people's minds and more importantly into their hearts, I suppose, you know. So I still think it's possible to do it, you know. But and I think listen to great bands, listen to the Beatles. You know, you know, you can. Some people sort of say, "Well, what's the relevance of the Beatles now?" The relevance is they wrote amazing songs, you know, and you know, their songwriting.
They didn't really write many bad ones, did they? That was
Absolutely. Yeah. But their songwriting techniques, you know, are come from George Gershwin and Cole Porter and those classic songwriters from the 40s and 50s, as well as from, you know, folk songs, as well as from Dylan, you know, and as well as from just straight ahead pop, you know. But I think their musicality, that was, I think Pete Townsend said something like, you know, the Beatles turned pop music into art, and they did, you know. And I think that's the task of any musician, really, you know, turn your music into art, and that's the way forward.
It's been interesting talking about your career and what you've achieved in music and so on, but also you have a son, quite a well-known son, who followed the path of acting, Jack Ryder.
Yeah,
famous for being on the soap EastEnders.
Yeah.
Do you feel you've kind of been a big influence in his life and making his kind of creative choices? And were you kind of words of wisdom when he turned around to you and said, "I want to be an actor"? How did that kind of play out, that father-son relationship?
Yeah. Interesting question. I mean, I have 3 children, so 2 sons, you know, and a daughter, Violet. So there's Harry, who's the oldest one. And I think all 3 of them, I said to them, you know, the Joseph Campbell line, "Follow your bliss." Basically, you know, if you want to do something, do it, you know, and don't really sort of consider a plan B, you know. I'm sure if they were, the 3 of them were sitting here now, they'd all be in hysterics, kind of, you know. But I think, you know, Jack had, from a very young age, you know, he was obsessed with movies and, you know, watched a lot of them. He was, could sit at the dinner table and he would just suddenly, you know, go, and this is when he was like sort of 9, 10, 11, 12, go through a speech from a movie like Independence Day or something like that, or he'd drop in a line from a movie at a particular point. He's very, very funny, very quick, and you know, so he was always sort of on that track. I think he decided that he didn't want to go into the 6th form at school, that he wanted to go to a sort of drama college thing, which was going to be in Dartford. I think they did a course where you concentrated on drama as part of your A levels and stuff. But right around that time was when he got this, he just went along to the EastEnders studios for a sort of like, it was like an open day thing that a friend of his had got invited to, and Jack tagged along, you know. But when I asked him about it, he said, yeah, it was good, but it was strange. You know, at the end of the day, they asked me and this girl to stay behind, and would we redo the screen test thing that because they'd done a, you know, put us all on camera and, you know, just for a laugh sort of thing. And I thought, well, that's interesting, you know. And then he got a call saying, would he come and do a proper audition? And then like a week after that, he got another call saying, don't bother with the audition. We want you to do this part, you know. So he was signed up for that. And yeah, whether I had any influence, I don't think I did really, apart from being encouraging about it. And in retrospect, I think it was a good thing that he did. I think he found it very, how shall I say, you know, again, the fame, you know, the actual acting, the on-screen stuff, I think he loved, you know, but everything that went with it, the high public profile, I think he found very difficult and stressful. Just, I mean, my public profile was nothing like as big as his, but I could certainly relate to that. And if I was a help to him, it was when things got difficult for him, you know. And I think I was always someone he could talk to and turn to, you know, so hopefully that all worked out. But I think each of my kids, you know, Harry's has a restaurant with his Italian wife, Simona, which is got incredible reviews. It's down in Margate, and you know, that's a very creative thing that he does, and music's a very important part of that restaurant as well. You know, the whole experience of being in the place is very much rooted in the music, as well as this amazing Italian food, you know. And then my daughter Violet is an actress, and she's done a lot of great work. She worked at the Old Vic, and or the Young, was it the Old Vic or the Young Vic? I get mixed up. But she was in a play there, and she continues to do a lot of acting work, you know. So yeah, I think I never expected my kids to have straight jobs, you know, and I've never encouraged them to sort of like, you know, have a job and then do what they wanted to do on the side. I've always said, do that, you know, and it will work out, you know, and especially if you're good at it. And I think it has for all three of them.
This is the final part of your take that I always enjoy. It's just some quick kind of fire questions to find out things you love in life and your take on particular things. So we'll just wrap up with these, if that's okay.
Sure.
First one, what is your favorite pastime?
Yeah, I don't know that I have pastimes really, but I think going to the opera, actually, going to the opera in European cities, which I haven't been able to do for 18 months now, you know. But yeah, that's a favourite pastime.
You've spoken a lot about film and cinema in the interview, but what's your favourite film and why?
Well, I think I'll stick to The Great Beauty, which is a Paolo Sorrentino movie. I love it because it's set in Rome, and it's just like a kind of beautiful love letter to Rome, really. And I love Italy, Rome as well. And so yeah, so The Great Beauty.
From film now to literature, who's your favourite novelist?
Well, without wanting to sound too pretentious, I think Thomas Mann. And my favourite book of his is The Magic Mountain.
If you could have had a different profession, what would it have been?
I never ever considered a different profession really, but probably teaching would be, and I'd have done a little bit of teaching, obviously teaching songwriting, you know. But if music had never really occurred, maybe I'd have been an English teacher or a history teacher. Those were the things I was interested in at school.
Who would you say has been your greatest inspiration in life?
That's a very difficult question. Probably, you know, from when I was a kid, John Lennon, I suppose, you know. But there've been lots down the line, you know, and I've met some very inspiring people, you know, Bill Friedkin being one of them. So.
Do you read a newspaper, and if so, which one?
No, I don't. I've never read newspapers.
Okay. What's your favourite food?
Polpette di pane, which is one of the dishes that Harry and Simona make.
From a greatest inspiration, but who would you say is your favourite cultural icon?
Across the board, cultural icon. A lot of things are flashing through my head at the moment.
Some tricky ones.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess Gustav Mahler, actually. He's the one I choose today.
always love this part. What is your favorite curse word and why?
I try not to curse too much. I think wazzock. Wazzock is a good curse word, and I just like the sound of it.
First time someone's chosen that one, so good
Yes.
choice. Nice one. What's your favorite place or holiday destination?
Venice.
Beautiful.
Venice, Italy. It's not Venice Beach, but although Venice Beach is great, but Venice, Italy. Yeah.
Totally unique. A tricky one for you. Who's your favorite music artist and what's your favorite album?
Well, these are all, I have a different answer every 20 minutes for this.
Yeah.
But right now, I'd say Miles Davis, and I'd say In a Silent Way.
And the last two, what's your greatest achievement to date?
My kids, I think.
That's a lovely answer. And the last one, how do you wish to be remembered?
I think as a kid from Gillingham who had a go at doing, just had a go at music, basically.
Had a go and did rather well. That's a really nice way to end the interview.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for giving up your time and joining us on Your Take today. I just wanted to ask, how do we find out more about your music and the current tour you're doing, the musical tour?
Sure. www.jackhughes.com for the tour dates and the larger scale things. But I'm on Facebook as Jack Hues and Instagram and Jack Hues Official and Twitter as well. So you can get in touch on those things. And I usually post, every week the stuff that I'm doing and what's happening. And certainly over the next few weeks, it's going to be pretty lively with the album coming out and this video I'm making and all of that stuff. So there should be lots to check out.
Good luck with the music video and all your future endeavors, and importantly, the musical tour as well. Thanks for your time, and it's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you kindly.
No, thank you, James. Thank you for preparing the questions and doing a great job.